Here we have a well and often used DeWalt compound sliding miter saw, and we're going to discuss what the different pieces and parts are and what their function is. Back down here, we're going to do this one arm, so we'll see how this goes. If I push down on the handle and I pull back on this, I'll be able to unlock that saw so it can go up and down, travel up and down. Up here, we've got our handle and our trigger. If we pull this, the saw is going to turn on. Over here we have a light that I personally don't care for, but some people like to use it. We've got our blade guard here. This is what allows us to bring that saw up and down without getting our hands in a position to touch that blade. It operates on its own. We've got the saw table. We've got the fence. And then down here, we've got our miter gauge. This tells us where we're at. This is how we unlock the miter function so it can spin, and it's gonna lock into some preset locations. And if we wanna put it somewhere and lock it in an area where it's doesn't have one of these notches, then we would push down on this to lock it into place, okay? So we're gonna unlock that. Push this down, get it back to 0. We'll lock that just for safety's sake. Then we're gonna look back here. We've got a bevel gauge. So this is a compound miter saw because we can unlock this by spinning this. So once I get this loosened back here, I can roll this out in one direction, and I can look at my bevel gauge to set it at whatever degree I want it to be set at. Then I would tighten that. If I had 3 hands, I would tighten that knob in the back, and I would tighten it at the location that I wanted it, and I'd be able to cut now at a bevel. There's a stop in the back that I can pull out right here. Pull that out, and that'll allow me to bevel this in the opposite direction. For now, we want it set at 0, and we're gonna lock that back down. Over here, we've got a clamp. If you've got something that you are unable to hold tightly, you can crank this down to clamp that. Most generally, you're gonna just hold it with your hand. Okay, so let's talk about how to safely operate this saw. We're gonna make sure that we hold things tight to the table and tight to the fence. If we try to make a cut like this, I want you to think about what might happen if those teeth were to engage that piece of wood right now. Look at the direction that they are rotating. As they make contact with the wood, they are pushing that way. And so if I were to be holding this away from the fence with my fingers in between there, you can bet that I'm gonna get my fingers pinched as the blade makes contact and it pushes that thing tight to the fence. Likewise, if we were to bring this sliding saw out and then push it in when it makes contact, now the blades are pushing upward. So I want you to be aware that if instead of just making your cut like this, if you were to come out, as some students do, they instead of pushing down, they pull out, and then you were to push in, and you were to do it quickly, which a lot of students will do if they're not prepared for this, what will happen is the force of that blade might want to lift that piece of wood up. So what we're going to do is we're going to make sure we're tight to the fence, or tight to the table rather, and tight to the fence, and we're going to bring this straight down to make our cut. We're not going to pull it out and push it back. That would be for a more advanced cut. You will not need to do any of that at this point. So let's talk about where to put your hand. We know that we want to stay at least 4 inches away from the blade at all times. And you might think to yourself, well, farther away is better. But if I get myself way out here, it doesn't matter how much pressure I put down on this, it's very easy to lift up on this piece of wood. So instead, I want to stay 4 inches away, but I want to be close enough that I can apply a sufficient amount of down pressure with these fingers and back pressure with my thumb. Now, I'm gonna look down through the front of this vented blade guard, and I'm gonna line up with an imaginary line. I don't have a line on there right now, but I'm gonna line it up where I want it, and then I would never want to start the saw in this position, would I? Because that blade, if it takes off, it's gonna splinter and kick the wood. Instead, I'm gonna raise this to full height, hold this good and tight. I'm gonna pull the trigger and I'm gonna let it get to full speed before I bring it down to make my cut. So you can end this cut in one of two ways, like I just did, where I made the cut, I went to the top, and I shut the saw off. Or you could make the cut, let off the trigger in the down position, and wait for the saw to stop. What I want you to avoid is making your cut and then taking your hand off the trigger and letting the blade pass by the wood as it is slowing down, because there's a break inside of this saw, and that break, as it slows the blade down, there's side to side movement in that blade. And so at the very least, when you come up, you will that will cause you to not have a smooth cut here. But what it also may cause is, as you bring it up, it may, as it's slowing down, it may grab that off-cut piece, depending upon the size, and throw it, okay? So now I want to talk a little bit about what we would have happen if we were to cut an angle. So let's think about, we're cutting our angle or our miter. The direction that this saw blade is pushing is back that way. Well, we know that it can't go that way, so the only way that it can go is that way. So if I don't hold this sufficiently tight, when I go to make this cut, and I let that slide, what will happen is the blade will slowly push that board that way, and the blade will flex, but it'll only flex so much. And eventually, it will reach its limit, and it will bind. And when it binds, it will grab that wood, break it apart, and it will throw pieces, and it can be potentially dangerous. So we want to make sure that this thing cannot move at all, especially when we're cutting on a miter like this. If you feel as though your hands are not strong enough to hold this piece, this would be a good time to run this clamp around, and we're not going to take the time to do it, but you could spin that around, get that over top of your piece, get it lined up exactly where you want it, and crank that down tight, okay? So if you have anything on the table, you're not gonna stick your hand up here and wipe things away. You're gonna use a table broom or a piece of scrap to clear all that wood away. You're gonna make sure that you never make a cut while you have pieces of scrap laying back here in the back portion of the saw. That's how you safely operate a miter saw. As we get further into the class, we'll discuss how to safely make a compound cut, where you're cutting both a miter and a bevel at the same time. At this point in the class, learning how to cut a miter safely is sufficient.